Harold Thompson's last words weren't, "I love you" or "goodbye." With trembling hands gripping his daughter's wrist, the 90-year-old farmer rasped his final warning, "Never touch the floor." For decades, locals had mocked his obsession with the old farmhouse's floorboards, how he'd patch them endlessly but never replace them. They called him paranoid, maybe crazy, but in that sterile hospital room, Sarah saw something in her father's eyes that wasn't madness. It was pure, primal fear. "The readings," he gasped, fumbling with a hidden paper. "Check them at dawn. If they spike above—" His voice trailed off as monitors screamed into chaos. The paper slipped away, lost as medical staff flooded the room. Those were the last moments Sarah had with her father, and his final message wasn't about love or family. It was about the farmhouse floor. What lay beneath those ancient boards would expose decades of government secrets and reveal a hidden threat that could devastate the entire region. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Thompson's rental car crunched over the gravel driveway of her childhood home, the sound eerily unchanged after 15 years away. The old farmhouse loomed before her, its weathered clapboards painted orange by the setting sun. Her father had stubbornly refused to change a single thing about the place, right down to the perpetually crooked mailbox that still bore his handwriting. H. Thompson, no solicitors, no exceptions. The engine died, but Sarah sat frozen behind the wheel, her father's final words echoing in her mind. "Never touch the floor." What kind of last words were those? Not, "I'm sorry for driving you away," or "I should have supported your dreams." Just another cryptic warning about the house he'd prioritized over everything else, including his own family. The porch steps creaked under her weight, another sound frozen in time. The key was exactly where it had always been, hidden in the fake bird's nest Dad insisted on keeping despite her childhood protests about how obvious it was. Some things never changed. Or maybe they did, she thought, noticing how the ancient floorboards seemed to groan differently under her feet. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and her father's pipe tobacco, a scent that transported her instantly back to tense family dinners and arguments about her future. The living room was a museum of decades past. The same worn armchair where he'd spent countless nights studying papers she wasn't allowed to see. The same heavy curtains that were never fully opened. The same meticulously maintained floorboards. And that had been an obsession she never understood. Sarah moved carefully through the house, hyper-aware of every step after her father's warning. The kitchen calendar still hung on its nail, marked with his precise handwriting, not appointments or birthdays, but times and numbers that meant nothing to her. November 17th, 4.2 stable. November 18th, 4.1 check basement calibration. The basement. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the doorknob, then froze. That had been the ultimate forbidden zone. Even as a teenager, she'd never been allowed down there. Farm equipment, Dad would say, nothing interesting. But she'd heard him down there late at night, moving things, taking measurements, speaking, in hushed tones on phone calls that would end abruptly if she came near. A sharp creak from above made her jump. Just the old house settling, she told herself. But was it? How well did she really know this place? Her father had spent 90 years here, most of them obsessing over every detail, especially those mysterious floorboards. What had he been protecting? Or what had he been protecting them from? The real estate agent's words rang in her head. "Prime farmland, Ms. Thompson. Developers are very interested. All it needs is some modernization, starting with those old floors." She'd nearly signed the papers last week, ready to be rid of this place and all its mysteries. Now she was glad she hadn't. Sarah pulled out her phone, checking the signal. Barely one bar, just like always. Another thing her father had never fixed, though she now wondered if that had been intentional too. The screen lit up with messages from the attorney about the estate, from developers eager to make offers, from old friends offering condolences. She ignored them all, opening her camera instead. It was time to document everything, starting with those floorboards. If her father's last words meant anything, the truth she needed was right beneath her feet. The question was, did she really want to find it? A distant rumble of thunder broke her concentration. Through the window, she could see storm clouds gathering over the cornfields. A weather warning flashed on her phone, severe thunderstorm approaching. Sarah smiled grimly. Even the weather was the same. This house had weathered countless storms over the century it had stood here. But as she looked down at the worn floorboards beneath her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was just beginning. The storm hit just as Sarah was unpacking her overnight bag. Each lightning flash illuminated the house in stark bursts, casting strange shadows across those infamous floorboards. A particularly loud thunderclap sent her diving for a childhood memory. The night her father had caught her trying to pry up a loose board in her bedroom, she'd been 12, curious about the strange humming sound that sometimes came from beneath her room. Harold Thompson's reaction had been unprecedented. Not just anger, but pure terror. He'd grabbed her so hard it left bruises, dragging her from the room while shouting about safety protocols and containment measures. Words no normal farmer should know, let alone use. The next day, he'd installed new locks on every bedroom door. Sarah remembered watching from the kitchen as he worked, his movements precise and methodical, muttering calculations under his breath. That was the summer the rumors really started, about old Harold Thompson losing his mind. "Your father wasn't always like that," Martha Chen told her over coffee at the local diner the next morning. The elderly woman had run the town's grocery store for 40 years. Used to be the most normal farmer you'd ever meet. Then that government team came in 73, spent 3 weeks surveying his land. After they left, she shook her head. That's when the changes started. Sarah leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. What kind of changes? Small things at first. He started ordering strange equipment. Not farming stuff, mind you. Electronic gear, testing devices. Then the rules began. No one was allowed inside without his supervision. He fired 3 farmhands for stepping on the wrong floorboards, started taking these weird measurements at dawn every day. Lightning flashed outside the diner windows. The storm hadn't let up since last night. Martha glanced nervously at the sky before continuing, her voice lower. But the strangest thing, every time there was a big storm, your father would disappear into that basement, sometimes for days. When he'd come out, he looked different, like he'd been through war. Sarah remembered those disappearances, the strict instructions to never, under any circumstances, try to reach him in the basement during storms, the mysterious phone calls that would follow, always on the ancient landline he insisted on keeping. Did he ever explain? Give any reason? Martha's laugh was bitter. "Honey, your father had more secrets than the CIA, but he wasn't crazy, no matter what people said. There was purpose in everything he did, even if none of us understood it." Back at the house, Sarah found herself studying old photographs. In pictures from before 1973, her father looked carefree, young despite his 40 years. After that mysterious government survey, a change was visible. His eyes carried a weight, a knowledge that seemed to age him decades overnight. The most telling photo was from 1974. Harold stood in front of the farmhouse, clutching a stack of papers. Sarah had never noticed it before, but now she could see what looked like official government seals on the documents. More interesting was the device in his other hand, some kind of measuring tool she didn't recognize. Thunder rattled the windows. Again. Sarah's eyes were drawn to the floorboards, wondering for the 100th time what lay beneath. Her father had spent 50 years protecting whatever secret was down there. Had it protected them back, or had it slowly consumed him, turning a normal farmer into the obsessive man she'd grown up with? A loud crack from below made her jump. Not thunder this time. Something else. Something from the basement. Sarah grabbed her flashlight, hand hovering, over the basement doorknob. Her father's final warning echoed in her mind. Never touch the floor. But he hadn't said anything about the basement, had he? The basement door opened with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the storm-darkened house. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed steep wooden stairs disappearing into darkness. The air that drifted up carried a strange metallic tang, unlike any normal basement smell she'd known. Her foot had barely touched the first step when another crack echoed from below, followed by what sounded like humming. Not electrical, but something deeper, almost subsonic. The same sound she'd heard as a child through her bedroom floor. The basement wasn't what she expected. Instead of farm equipment or storage, she found walls lined with filing cabinets, each labeled with dates spanning 5 decades. A massive desk dominated one corner, covered in papers and what looked like scientific equipment. But most striking was the floor, concrete, not wood, marked with an intricate grid of painted lines and numbers. "Oh, Dad," Sarah whispered, "what were you doing down here?" The first file cabinet she opened contained hundreds of notebooks, each filled with her father's precise handwriting. The entries followed a strict pattern. November 17th, 1973, first anomaly detected. Government team confirms readings, containment protocols established. God help us if this spreads. November 18th, 1973, 3.2 on modified Richter. Subsonic frequencies increasing. They say the floor will hold if properly maintained. Must check readings. Daily, November 19th, 1973. Dr. Morrison explains the fault line theory. Not geological, something else. Equipment installed. Training begins tomorrow. Sarah's hands trembled as she moved forward through the years. The entries grew more detailed, more technical. Her father, who'd never finished high school, was recording complex calculations and using terminology that belonged in physics journals. March 3, 1982, spiked to 4.7 during thunderstorm, contained. New frequency patterns emerging. Floor holding but requires reinforcement. Morrison says we're lucky. Other sites weren't as successful. March 4th, 1982, second team arrives. More equipment, more questions. They don't understand that the readings aren't the real threat. It's growing aware. A photo fell from between the pages, her father with a group of serious-looking men in government suits. The caption read, "Containment Team Alpha, Site 7. Her father was wearing some kind of badge she'd never seen before. The next cabinet contained maps of the region, overlaid with concentric circles centered on their farm. Notes in the margins referenced other sites and containment zones. Names of nearby towns were marked with dates and cryptic symbols. A leather-bound journal from 1995 caught her eye. Unlike the others, this one was personal. Sarah asked questions again today. She's too smart, notices too much. Sometimes I think she can sense it too, but I can't tell her. The agreement was clear. Absolute secrecy. Even from family. Especially from family. Better she think I'm just a crazy old man than know what's really beneath our feet. Thunder boomed overhead, closer now. The humming from beneath the floor intensified, and one of the measuring devices on the desk suddenly lit up. Sarah picked it up, recognizing it from the 1974 photo. The display showed numbers climbing. 3.2, 3.7, 4.1. Her father's voice seemed to echo in her mind. Check the readings at dawn. If they spike above... Above what? The answer had to be in these files somewhere. But as another crack resonated through the basement and the humming grew stronger, Sarah wondered if she had time to find it. A new sound caught her attention, vehicles on the gravel driveway. Through the small basement window, she saw black SUVs pulling up to the house. Men in dark suits were already getting out, moving with urgent purpose through the storm. They knew, somehow they knew the readings were spiking. Just like they'd known in 1973, Sarah grabbed the leather journal and the photo, then headed for the stairs. But she paused at the bottom, looking back at the grid-marked floor. For the first time, she noticed that the lines formed a pattern, not random measurements, but a perfect spiral, centered on a point that seemed to pulse with that deep, impossible humming. Sarah had just enough time to hide the journal in her jacket before the pounding started on the front door. The basement humming had reached a fever pitch, and the device in her hand now read 4.8, higher than any reading she'd seen in her father's. Notes, "Ms. Thompson," a commanding voice carried through the old house. "This is Agent Carson with the Department of Energy. We need you to evacuate immediately. The storm has created unsafe conditions." Department of Energy. Sarah's mind raced as she climbed the stairs. The same agency mentioned in her father's 1973 journals. This wasn't a coincidence. She opened the door to find 3 men in black suits, their earpieces crackling with urgent communications. The lead agent's eyes immediately went to the basement door behind her. "You've been in the containment zone," he said. Not a question. His hand moved subtly toward his weapon. "Did you touch anything? Disturb any equipment?" Before Sarah could answer, the floor beneath them groaned. Not the normal settling of an old house. This was different. The sound seemed to come from deep below the foundation, accompanied by a vibration that made the windows rattle. "Readings at 4.9 and climbing," one of the other agents reported, holding a device identical to the one Sarah had found in the basement. "Containment field is destabilizing. Ms. Thompson, we need to—" Agent Carson's words cut off as a deafening crack split the air. The floorboards between them suddenly buckled, wood splintering upward as if pushed from below. Sarah stumbled backward, her father's warning screaming in her mind. Through the broken boards came a glow, not electric or phosphorescent, but something else entirely. It pulsed with the same frequency as the humming, casting impossible shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. "Protocol 7, Carson shouted into his radio. "I repeat, Protocol 7, the Thompson site is going critical." More vehicles were arriving now, large trucks with government markings and what looked like scientific equipment. Teams in hazmat suits were already deploying across the farm, setting up a perimeter, but Sarah barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on what she could see through that broken section of floor. Beneath the standard foundation lay another surface, something that looked like metal but rippled like water. And embedded in that impossible material were symbols glowing with that same otherworldly light. She recognized those symbols. They matched the ones in her father's journals, the ones she'd always assumed were his own cryptic shorthand. But these weren't human writing. They couldn't be. "My God," Carson whispered, his professional demeanor cracking as he stared into the hole. "It's never breached containment before. Your father, he managed to keep it dormant for 50 years. The humming reached a crescendo. Through the basement window, Sarah caught glimpses of more symbols, beginning to glow through the soil of the farm itself, forming a massive pattern with the house at its center. Her father's final warning took on a whole new meaning. This wasn't about protecting the floor. It was about containing something beneath it, something that was now breaking free. The local library's microfiche archives weren't exactly where Sarah expected to end up after being evacuated for her safety. But Agent Carson's team had been surprisingly easy to slip away from during the chaos. Their attention was focused entirely on the farm, giving her the chance she needed to start piecing this puzzle together. "And Paintree, 1973, she muttered, scrolling through old newspapers. The government survey her father mentioned had to have made some kind of local news. A group of officials spending 3 weeks on a farm wouldn't go unnoticed in a town this small. Looking for something specific, Sarah jumped at the voice. An elderly man stood behind her, his tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses screaming academic. But it was the symbol on his laptop bag that caught her attention, identical to one she'd seen glowing beneath her father's floor. "Professor Daniel Martinez," he said, extending his hand, "and you must be Harold Thompson's daughter." Sarah tensed. "How did you know who you are?" He smiled sadly. "I've been waiting for you to show up here. Your father, he made me promise to help you understand when the time came, though I'd hoped it wouldn't be quite so soon." He glanced at his watch. "Or quite so urgent." Martinez led her to a private study room, checking twice to ensure they weren't followed. From his briefcase, he pulled out a folder that looked decades old. Your father wasn't the only one keeping records. The documents inside told a story. That seemed impossible. In 1973, unusual seismic readings had been detected across 7 sites in North America. But these weren't normal earthquake patterns. The vibrations were ordered, Martinez explained, spreading out graphs. Mathematical, intentional, like something was trying to communicate. Communicate? With what? That's the question that kept your father up at night for 50 years. Martinez lowered his voice. The government claims it's a natural phenomenon, some kind of geological resonance. But Harold, he discovered the truth. Those symbols you saw, they're not just random patterns. They're changing, evolving, growing, more complex year by year. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, showing Martinez a photo she'd managed to snap of the glowing floor. These symbols, you know what they mean? The professor's face went pale. Some of them, yes. I've spent my career studying similar patterns in ancient sites around the world. But these, he pointed to specific markings. These are new, and they shouldn't be possible. Why not? Because they're responding to us, to our presence, to our technology. These patterns, they're not just a message. They're part of something that's been here long before us, waiting. And now, after 50 years of containment, he met her eyes. It's waking up. A noise in the library corridor made them both freeze. Through the study room's window, Sarah caught a glimpse of a black suit disappearing around a corner. "We need to move," Martinez said quickly, gathering the documents. "There's someone else you need to meet, someone who worked with your father. In the early days, before the government shut down the real research." "Who?" "James Cooper. He was part of the original survey team, but he broke with the official story. He's been in hiding ever since, continuing the work in secret. And if those symbols are really evolving like this..." Martinez checked his watch again. "We don't have much time." As they slipped out the library's back exit, Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert. The local news was reporting unusual seismic activity across the region. 7 distinct locations, forming a perfect geometric pattern, just like in 1973. Professor Martinez's someone else turned out to be Dr. Helen Wright, a geophysicist whose equipment-filled van looked more like a mobile command center than a research vehicle. They'd returned to the farm under cover of darkness, using the chaos of the ongoing evacuation to slip past the perimeter. "Your father's containment grid is failing," Dr. Wright explained, studying readings from sensors she'd managed to place around the property. "These energy signatures, they're unlike anything I've recorded at the other sites." Sarah watched the screens, trying to make sense of the oscillating patterns. "Other sites? You mean the 7 locations from 1973? 6 now," Martinez corrected grimly. "Site 3 in Nevada. There's nothing left. The whole area's under military. A quarantine. Official story blamed it on weapons testing. An unofficial story?" Before he could answer, Wright's equipment erupted in alerts. "Movement under the foundation," she announced, adjusting controls. "Look at this ground-penetrating radar image." The screen showed layers of soil and rock beneath the house, but something was wrong with the scale. The foundation didn't stop at the normal depth. Instead, it extended down impossibly far, the concrete somehow transitioning into that same metallic but not metal material Sarah had glimpsed through the broken floor. "That's not possible," Wright whispered. "These readings suggest it's changing. Density, responding to our scans." A low vibration began to build, making the equipment rattle. Through the van's windows, Sarah could see new patterns of light beginning to pulse beneath the soil, spreading outward from the house like ripples in a pond. "Temperatures dropping," Martinez reported, his breath suddenly visible in the cold. "Just like Nevada." Sarah pulled out her father's journal, frantically flipping pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, March 15th, 1989. Temperature drop precedes phase shift. Must maintain frequency dampeners at all costs. If the resonance patterns align... The ground shuddered. In the distance, emergency sirens began to wail. "They're evacuating the whole town," Wright said, checking her phone. "Government's claiming a chemical spill, but look at these readings. The energy signature is expanding geometrically." Sarah's mind raced. The floor. Dad was obsessed with maintaining those specific boards. What if they weren't just covering something? What if they were part of the containment system? Martinez's eyes widened in understanding. "The grid pattern in the wood grain. Your father wasn't just repairing those boards. He was maintaining a frequency-dampening matrix. The specific density and spacing created interference patterns that kept whatever this is in a dormant state. And now that pattern is broken," Wright added, pointing to her screens. "Look at these harmonic progressions. It's not just waking up, it's solving the equations we used to contain it. Learning." The vibrations intensified. Outside, floodlights snapped on as more government vehicles arrived. Through the trees, Sarah caught glimpses of what looked like military hardware being moved into position. "They're going to try to force it back into dormancy," Martinez said. "But they don't understand. The old methods won't work anymore. Your father knew this day was coming. That's why he left you that warning. He wasn't trying to keep you away from the floor. He was trying to keep me from breaking the pattern," Sarah finished. "But if that's true, then why did he spend so much time in the basement? What was he doing down there all those years?" Wright's equipment screamed with new alerts. On her screens, the impossible structure beneath the house was changing, geometric patterns shifting like a vast puzzle solving itself. "We need to get to that basement," Sarah decided. "Whatever Dad was working on down there, it wasn't just about containment. He was trying to understand it, communicate with it." "Sarah," Martinez's voice was urgent, "if we go down there now, No, but look at those readings. Whatever's been waiting under this farm for 50 years, it's done waiting." The basement looked different now. The government teams had stripped away most of the filing cabinets, but they'd missed something crucial, a false back panel that popped open at Sarah's touch, revealing a hidden safe. "Your father showed me this once," Martinez said, moving to the keypad. "The combination, it was based on the original frequency patterns from 1973. His fingers moved quickly. 3, 2, 7, 4, 8, 9. The safe clicked open. Inside lay a single red folder marked Project Echo and dated 1943, 30 years before the official discovery. "That's impossible," Wright breathed, examining the yellowed papers. "The energy signatures weren't detected until 73. "That's what they wanted everyone to believe," Martinez replied. "But look at these documents. The government knew something was here during World War II. They detected it while testing early radar systems." Sarah spread the papers across her father's desk. The first page showed a familiar pattern. 7 points across North America, forming the same geometric shape they'd seen in the current readings. But what caught her attention was a series of photographs paper-clipped to the report. "These symbols," she said, pointing to markings visible in the old black and white images. They're different from the ones we saw today. Simpler. Because they were dormant then, Wright realized, comparing the photos to her current readings. The patterns have been evolving, growing more complex, like a language developing over time. A sudden tremor shook dust from the ceiling. Above them, they could hear the government teams moving through the house. Your father wasn't just maintaining containment, Martinez said quickly, pulling more documents from the folder. He was part of a secret research group, scientists who believed we weren't dealing with a natural phenomenon at all, but a form of communication. Look at these response patterns. The graphs showed clear cause and effect relationships. Every time humans had tried to study the sites, the energy patterns had changed, adapted, responded. It was learning from us, Sarah whispered. For 50 years, it's been learning. Not just learning, Wright added, her face pale as she studied her instruments. Look at these new patterns. They're not random. They're forming sequences, mathematical. Progressions is not just responding anymore, it's solving. Solving what? Before Wright could answer, heavy footsteps sounded on the basement stairs. Agent Carson's voice carried down, "Ms. Thompson, we know you're down there. Come up now, and we can discuss this reasonably." Sarah quickly photographed the documents with her phone while Martinez sealed them back in the safe. But as they turned to leave through the hidden emergency exit her father had shown her as a child, something caught her eye. On the wall behind where the safe had been, a sequence of numbers was carved into the concrete. 89, 43, 17, 61, 05, 32, below. It in her father's handwriting. When it solves the equation, use these. God forgive me. Another tremor rocked the basement, stronger this time. Through the small window they could see new patterns of light spreading across the farm, the symbols pulsing with increasing intensity. "Sarah," Wright called urgently from her equipment. "These readings, they're forming a coherent pattern, the same sequence over and over." "What sequence?" 89, 43, 17, 61, 05, 32. The numbers her father had carved into the wall. Whatever he'd spent 50 years preparing for, it was happening now. They escaped through the hidden tunnel, just as Carson's team breached the basement, emerging in an old storm cellar 50 yards from the house. But Sarah's mind was still on those numbers, turning them over and over, trying to understand their significance. "Dr. Wright," she said as they hurried through the darkness. "The original containment system. What exactly was it measuring?" "Frequencies," Wright replied, checking her equipment. "Specific harmonic patterns that seemed to keep the energy signatures dormant. Your father's floorboards were part of a larger dampening system." But what if they weren't dampening anything? Sarah stopped, pulling out her phone to show them the photos she'd taken. "Look at these original equations from 1943. They're not describing containment protocols. They're showing response patterns." Martinez leaned in, squinting at the screen. "My God," he whispered, "they weren't containing it. They were solving it," Sarah finished. "The whole system, the floorboards, the measurements, the daily readings. It wasn't about keeping something down. It was about working through a problem, an equation that's taken 50 years to solve." A new tremor shook the ground, stronger than any before. In the distance, they could see the farmhouse now surrounded by pulsing geometric patterns of light, spreading outward in perfect mathematical progressions. Wright's equipment suddenly came alive, screens filling with data. These energy signatures, they're not just growing stronger, they're synchronizing. All 7 sites are activating simultaneously. Sarah's phone buzzed, an emergency alert. Similar phenomena were being reported across the country. The government's chemical spill cover story was falling apart as videos of glowing geometric patterns spread across social media. "The numbers," Sarah said suddenly. "Dad's sequence, 89, 43, 17, 61, 05 to 32. They're not measurements, they're coordinates." Martinez pulled up a map on his laptop, plotting the numbers. "She's right. Look at this pattern. It matches exactly with the 7 sites, but there's something else. His fingers flew across the keyboard. These aren't just location markers, they're timestamps, specific moments when the energy signatures peaked. And they're counting down, Wright added, her voice shaking as she studied her readings. Whatever your father and his team were working toward, it's about to happen. The ground shuddered again. Above them, the night sky had taken on a strange, rippling quality, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. Sarah, Martinez said, urgently. Your father's journal. What exactly did he write about the readings at dawn? She pulled out the leather-bound book, flipping to the last entry. Her father's normally precise handwriting had been shaky, desperate. When the readings spike above 7.0, the resonance patterns will align. 50 years of calculations leading to this moment. They thought we were containing it, but we were helping it solve the equation. God help us all if we got the answer wrong. A high-pitched tone cut through the air, making them cover their ears. Wright's equipment was going haywire, screens flooding with impossible data. Current reading is 6.8, she reported, voice tight with fear. And climbing. In the distance, they could hear sirens and shouting as military vehicles poured into the area. But Sarah's attention was fixed on the farmhouse, her father's life's work, now the epicenter of something beyond understanding. He knew this was coming, she realized. Everything he did, the obsession with the floor, the daily measurements, the secret research. He wasn't trying to stop it. He was making sure we solved it correctly. Solved what? Wright demanded. Before Sarah could answer, a new sound filled the air. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The glowing patterns around the farm pulsed in sync with it, forming new, impossibly complex symbols. It's not an equation, Sarah whispered, finally understanding. It's a response. For 50 years, something has been trying to communicate with us, and we're about to find out what it's been trying to say. The storm cellar's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as Sarah spread out her father's journal, searching for answers. The resonant tone from outside had settled into a steady pulse, like a vast heartbeat beneath the earth. Your father wasn't the first, Martinez said quietly, pulling an old leather case from his bag. Each site had a guardian, someone chosen to monitor and maintain the communication process. They called themselves the Shepherds of Dawn. Inside the case lay 7 photographs, yellowed with age. 7 farms spread across the country, each built to the same exact specifications. And in front of each stood a family, their expressions bearing the same weight Sarah had always seen in her father's eyes. The government thought they were containing these sites, Martinez continued. But the shepherds knew better. They understood this wasn't a threat to be suppressed. It was a conversation 50 years in the making. Wright's equipment chimed another warning. Reading at 6.9, she reported. The resonance patterns are reaching critical synchronization. Sarah studied the old photos. These other families. What happened to them? Most died protecting their sites, Martinez replied grimly, or went mad trying to solve the equation before it was ready. Your father was the last of the original shepherds. The others, he gestured to the photos. The Nevada family tried forcing a solution in '82. That's why there's nothing left of Site 3. The Montana shepherds cracked under the pressure, abandoned their post in '95. Their site went dark a week later. But Dad stayed, Sarah whispered. He solved it. No, Martinez corrected. He understood that it couldn't be solved through force or brilliance. It had to evolve naturally. A half-century dialogue between humanity and whatever lies beneath these sites. Each generation of shepherds adding their part to the conversation. A new tremor rocked the cellar. Through the small window, they could see military vehicles establishing a perimeter, their spotlights cutting through the strange, rippling air. The original shepherds, Sarah said, picking up one of the photos. How did they know? How did they understand what they were dealing with? Martinez's expression darkened. Because they made first contact. In 1943, 7 families were chosen. Farmers, mostly. Simple people who lived close to the land. They were gathered in secret and shown something that changed them forever. He pulled out an ancient film reel canister. This is the only surviving record of that day. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the canister. And this is what Dad was protecting, what all the shepherds died keeping secret. Not keeping it secret, Wright interrupted, her eyes fixed on her readings. Keeping it safe. Until it was ready. Until we were ready, the resonant tone shifted, its frequency climbing higher. New patterns of light spiraled out from the farmhouse, forming shapes that seemed to twist in impossible ways. Reading at 6:95, Wright announced. Whatever's coming, it's almost here. Sarah opened her father's journal to its final pages. Found entries she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the binding. As she read, her father's lifelong obsession finally made sense. The shepherds weren't just maintaining sites, she said. They were teaching it, showing it how to communicate with us safely. All those measurements, the daily readings, they were lessons, building a common language piece by piece. And now? Wright asked, her equipment screaming with new alerts. Now, it's ready to talk back. Sarah stood facing the farmhouse that had been both her prison and her inheritance. Dad's last warning wasn't about staying away from the floor, it was about being ready for this moment. Martinez gripped her arm. Sarah, if you go back out there, I have to. I'm a shepherd's daughter. And whatever's about to happen, whatever's been waiting 50 years to speak, it needs someone who understands the language it learned from us. The resonant tone reached a new pitch. Around the farm, reality itself seemed to bend and flex, the geometric patterns forming doorways to somewhere else. Reading at 6:98, Wright whispered. Synchronization in 3 minutes. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 3 generations of shepherds in the decision before her. Then we better not keep it waiting any longer. The military response was overwhelming. As Sarah watched from the storm cellar window, more vehicles poured in, not just regular army, but specialized units with equipment she'd never seen before. Agent Carson's voice boomed through loudspeakers, cutting through the otherworldly resonance. This is your final warning. The site is now under direct federal control. All civilians must evacuate immediately. We are authorized to use lethal force. They're panicking, Martinez observed, watching through binoculars. Look at their formation. They're setting up for containment protocols, the same ones that failed in Nevada. Wright's equipment chirped urgently. Reading at 6:99. But there's something else. She adjusted controls frantically. The other 6 sites, they're all experiencing identical readings, perfect synchronization. Sarah's phone buzzed with emergency alerts. Reports were flooding in from across the country. Strange lights. Impossible. Sounds, reality itself, seeming to warp around specific locations. The government's cover story was falling apart in real time. Incoming, Martinez warned as a new vehicle approached, a black SUV unlike the others. Through its tinted windows, Sarah caught a glimpse of faces she recognized from her father's hidden photos. The original government team from 1973, Director Collins. Carson's voice carried across the farm as an elderly man emerged from the SUV. Sir, we're ready to begin emergency containment procedures. Containment isn't possible anymore, the director replied, his voice carrying decades of weight. Deploy the failsafe, all sites. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd seen references to failsafe protocols in her father's journals, notes that ended with warnings written in shaking hands. They're going to try to destroy all 7 sites simultaneously, Martinez realized, checking his phone. Reports coming in. Military units mobilizing at every location. They can't, Sarah protested. "If they interrupt the synchronization now, it'll make Nevada look like a firecracker." Wright finished, her screens flooding with new data. The energy patterns are too deeply integrated. A forced shutdown now would cascade through all 7 sites. Through the window, they watched teams deploying what looked like massive electrical equipment, Tesla coils on steroids, humming with barely contained power. "The failsafe will kill everyone within 50 miles, Martinez said quietly. "But they'd rather risk that than face what's coming." Sarah's mind raced. Her father had predicted this, prepared for it. In his final journal entries, he'd written about the government's fear, their inability to accept what the shepherds had understood from the beginning. "We have to stop them," she decided. "Not just here, at all the sites. There has to be a way to—" She tripped over something in the dark cellar, an old ham radio setup covered in dust. But the dials were set to specific frequencies that matched the numbers from her father's wall. "The shepherds," she breathed. "They had their own communication network, a way to coordinate between sites." She began turning dials, and the radio crackled to life with voices. Site 4 reporting, military units deploying failsafe equipment. Site 6, same situation, energy readings approaching critical. Site 2, we need coordinates for synchronized response. "They're still out there," Martinez said in awe. Other children of the original shepherds protecting their sites. Wright's equipment screamed a new warning. Outside, the geometric patterns pulsed faster, brighter. "Reading at 6/95. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be now." Sarah grabbed the radio mic, her father's final words echoing in her mind. This was what he'd prepared her for. Not just to witness the communication, but to protect it, to ensure that 50 years of patient dialogue wasn't destroyed by fear. "This is Site 7, she broadcast. "My father was Harold Thompson, and I know how to stop the failsafe." The radio network crackled with coordinated responses as Sarah laid out her father's final plan. But time was running out. Outside, the military's fail-safe equipment hummed with increasing power, while the otherworldly resonance from beneath. The farm reached new frequencies, reading at 6.997, Wright reported. Her equipment screens were barely readable through the strange distortions in the air. "The patterns, they're forming some kind of doorway," Sarah finished. Through the cellar window, they could see it taking shape. A perfect geometric portal hanging in space above the farmhouse, mirrored by identical formations at the other 6 sites. Reality itself seemed to bend around its edges. Martinez pulled out the 1943 film canister with trembling hands. "You need to see this, now, before it's too late." He loaded the ancient film into a small projector as Wright aimed it at the cellar wall. The grainy footage showed a military briefing room. 7 families, the original shepherds, sat watching as a general explained something using charts and diagrams. But it was the next sequence that made Sarah's breath catch. The film showed her grandfather, young and uncertain, standing in this very farmhouse. The floorboards had been pulled up, revealing not dirt or foundation, but a perfect geometric pattern embedded in something that looked like liquid metal. As they watched, symbols began appearing in the surface, responding to human presence. "The government thought they'd discovered some kind of weapon," Martinez explained. "An alien technology they could control." But the shepherds understood the truth. These sites weren't weapons at all. They were nodes. Connection points. Connection points to what? Before he could answer, Wright's equipment erupted in new alerts. "Energy reading at 6.998. The resonance patterns are reaching quantum coherence." Sarah's phone buzzed. The other shepherd descendants reporting similar readings at their sites. The geometric portals were stabilizing, their edges becoming more defined. Your father finally understood what these sights really are, Martinez said urgently. Why they appeared in this specific pattern. Why they needed 50 years to establish communication. They're not just doorways to somewhere else. They're doorways to someone else. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. The liquid metal surface, the evolving symbols, the careful building of communication over decades. Time travelers, she whispered. They're time travelers. From so far in our future that direct communication would be catastrophic, Martinez confirmed. They needed generations to establish a safe dialogue, to learn how to interact with our level of reality without destroying it. Your father and the other shepherds, they weren't just maintaining sights. They were teaching our descendants how to reach back through time without shattering existence itself. Outside, Director Collins was giving the order to power up the failsafe, but Sarah barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on the film's final sequence, showing what happened when the military had tried forcing communication in 1943. The footage ended in static and screams. The failsafe won't stop them, she realized. It'll just trigger the same catastrophe they've spent 50 years trying to prevent, the same disaster that turned Nevada into a quarantine zone. Right screens flashed with new data. Reading at 6.999. Quantum coherence reaching critical threshold. Sarah grabbed the radio mic. All sites, initialize synchronization protocols. Use the frequency patterns from your family records, the ones they taught us, the ones we taught them. She could feel it now, the weight of 3 generations of shepherds, the responsibility of ensuring humanity's first contact with its own future didn't end in disaster. Her father's apparent madness had been the sanest response possible to an impossible duty. Through the cellar window, they watched military personnel scrambling to activate the failsafe, but above them, the geometric portal pulsed with impossible light as reality prepared to meet itself. Reading at 7.0, Wright whispered, and that's when the visitors began to arrive. They emerged from ripples in the air, human figures that seemed to phase in and out of reality, their forms distorted as if being viewed through water. The military's spotlights caught glimpses of faces that were almost familiar, yet fundamentally changed by thousands of years of evolution. All sites reporting similar manifestations, Martinez announced, monitoring the radio network. Temporal synchronization holding steady. But Sarah's attention was on Director Collins, who had grabbed a megaphone. Initialize failsafe, maximum power, don't let them fully materialize. The massive electrical equipment hummed to life, Tesla coils crackling with deadly energy. The air filled with the smell of ozone as capacitors charged. We have to stop them, Sarah said, pulling her father's journal from her jacket. The frequency patterns. There's a reason Dad made me memorize them as a child. They're not just measurements, they're a key. Wright finished, studying her readings. The same patterns we use to communicate. They could disrupt the failsafe equipment, but we'd need to broadcast them at massive power levels. Sarah's eyes locked on the farmhouse. The basement, Dad's equipment. He didn't just use it for monitoring. He built it to protect this moment. Through the cellar's window, they could see more figures emerging from the geometric portals. Their movements were careful, deliberate, the result of 50 years learning how to interact with this time period safely. Sarah, if you go out there, Martinez warned. I'm already out there, she said, moving toward the cellar door. We all are. Those are our descendants. Everything the shepherds did, everything my father dedicated his life to, was about making this moment possible. Wright's equipment burst with new alerts. Military powering up fail-safe to critical levels. If those energy patterns hit the temporal field, Sarah grabbed the radio mic. All sites, prepare to synchronize defensive protocols. Access your family equipment. You know the patterns, you've always known them. The other shepherds' children responded immediately, coordinates and frequencies flowing through the radio network. Generations of preparation crystallizing into a single moment, fail-safe at 80% power, Wright reported. Time displacement increasing at all sites. Sarah burst out of the cellar, Martinez and Wright close behind. The air had become almost liquid with temporal distortion. Through it, she could see the future humans moving with increasing clarity, their forms stabilizing as they learned to exist in this time period. Military personnel swung their weapons toward her, but Sarah never broke stride. She knew every inch of this farm, every board her father had maintained. More importantly, she knew what lay beneath them. Fail-safe at 90%, Wright called out. They reached the farmhouse just as Director Collins gave the order. Full power, end this now. But Sarah was already moving through the broken floorboards, dropping into the basement where her father's lifework waited. The real equipment wasn't in the filing cabinets or monitoring stations. It was built into the walls themselves, a quantum frequency generator disguised as ordinary wiring. "Sarah," Martinez shouted down, "whatever you're going to do." 97%. Wright's voice was desperate. Sarah's hands flew across controls her father had taught her to memorize, but never touch. Until now, until this moment, all sites, she broadcast one final time. Initialize quantum interference, now. Above her, the fail-safe equipment reached full power, just as Sarah activated her father's hidden system. 7 quantum frequency generators surged to life across the country, their patterns matching perfectly with the ones humanity had spent 50 years teaching its own future. The resulting energy wave wasn't an attack or a defense. It was a harmony, the completion of a conversation 3 generations in the making. The fail-safe equipment went dead, the military's weapons lost power, and in the sudden silence, Sarah heard something impossible, voices from thousands of years. In the future, speaking in patterns her father had taught her in childhood. The first contact humanity had been waiting for wasn't coming from the stars. It was coming from ourselves. The basement hummed with quantum energies as Sarah faced the impossible. Through the broken floorboards above, she could see them clearly now. Human figures that carried echoes of familiar features, transformed by millennia of evolution. Their movements were liquid grace, every gesture carrying purpose developed over thousands of years of preparation for this moment. "They're stabilizing," Wright reported, her equipment displaying patterns that defied physics. "The quantum field is holding at all 7 sites. Whatever you did, it worked." Director Collins' voice boomed from outside. "This is your final warning. Step away from the quantum interfere." His words cut off as one of the future humans raised a hand. Every electronic device in a mile radius went dead, except for Sarah's father's equipment. "The patterns," Martinez breathed, studying the symbols flowing across the basement walls. "They're not just communication protocols, they're evolutionary markers, shows of trust." Sarah understood. The future humans were demonstrating their power while deliberately limiting it, using only the capabilities they'd carefully introduced. Through 50 years of graduated contact, no shortcuts, no force, just the patient dialogue the shepherds had helped build. Sarah Thompson. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, using frequencies her father's equipment had been designed to translate. One of the figures moved toward her, its form rippling with temporal distortion. "Daughter of Harold, guardian of the 7th node." "I know who you are," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Dad, he prepared me, made sure I'd understand. The military is mobilizing reinforcements," Wright warned, checking her phone. "Heavy weapons. They're not giving up." But Sarah's attention was fixed on the future human before her. In its impossibly evolved features, she caught glimpses of something familiar, echoes of local families, of generations yet to be born. "You are in from here," she realized, "us, all of you. You're not just humanity's future, you're this community's future. These farms are our ancestors, the figure confirmed. We chose these sites because they were already significant to us, places where our own past was rooted. The shepherds were not chosen randomly. Through the broken ceiling, they could hear military helicopters approaching. The future humans made no move to stop them. They were following the protocols, limiting their actions to what had been carefully established over decades. They'll try to shut this down, Sarah said. They're afraid. Fear is natural, the figure replied. Change is difficult. That is why we needed the shepherds, to help humanity adapt gradually, to learn our presence would not destroy them. Martinez's radio crackled. Multiple strike teams incoming. ETA 3 minutes. Sarah felt the weight of her father's lifetime of preparation, of 3 generations of shepherds maintaining this delicate balance. But she also felt something else, a certainty about what needed to be done. You've shown us your restraint, she said to the future human. Now let me show you ours. Let me prove the shepherds taught us as much as we taught you. She moved to her father's equipment, hands flying across controls she'd watched him use for decades. The quantum field generators hummed with new frequencies. Not the future humans' patterns, but the response harmonics the shepherds had developed. All sites, she broadcast. Initiate synchronization protocol 7. Show them we understand. Around the farm, around all 7 sites, reality rippled as past and future found their balance. The future humans' forms stabilized further as the quantum fields aligned perfectly, not through their power, but through humanity's measured response. The shepherds chose well, the figure said, its voice carrying approval. Now, let us show you why we have come. Above them, military helicopters roared closer. But Sarah knew they were too late to stop what was coming. The real first contact wasn't going to be a catastrophe or a conquest. It was going to be a conversation 3 generations in the making. The military helicopters landed in formation around the farm as the future humans gathered in the quantum field above the house. Director Collins approached under heavily armed escort, his face a mask of barely controlled fear and determination. Ms. Thompson, he called out, you need to understand the bigger picture. If even one detail of their future knowledge contaminates our timeline, you think we don't know about temporal contamination? Sarah's voice carried across the farm. What do you think the shepherds spent 50 years preventing? Why do you think it took 3 generations to reach this point? The future humans made no move to interfere. They were following the protocols, letting humanity work through this moment as they had been taught. Your father was a good man, Collins said, softer now. But he was just a farmer. He couldn't have understood the complexities of temporal physics, the dangers of show him, Sarah commanded, turning to her father's equipment. Show him what Dad really understood. Her hands moved across the controls, bringing up 50 years of data. Not just readings and measurements, but a carefully documented progression of temporal theory that made Collins's eyes go wide. Impossible, he whispered. These equations, this level of quantum understanding, wasn't just Dad, Sarah explained. It was all the shepherds, working together across 7 sites, building comprehension piece by piece. While you were trying to contain something you didn't understand, they were learning to communicate with it safely. Through the quantum field, the future humans' forms rippled with approval. They had waited centuries for this moment, for humanity to prove it could handle contact with its own future. Sarah, Martinez warned, more military units incoming. They're bringing temporal dampening equipment. She faced Collins directly. You have a choice to make, Director. You can keep trying to force this situation into something you can control. Or you can accept that maybe, just maybe, a group of farmers and their families understood something you missed. And what's that? That the best way to protect humanity from its future isn't to fight it or contain it. It's to help it arrive safely. The future humans moved in perfect synchronization, their forms stabilizing further as they demonstrated another carefully measured capability. Above the farm, the quantum field expanded, revealing glimpses of a future Earth transformed by millennia of evolution. My God, Collins breathed. That's what the shepherds were protecting, Sarah said. Not just our present, but our future's ability to reach back and guide us, to help us avoid the catastrophes they remember from their history. Military units were surrounding the farm now, weapons trained on the future humans who still made no move to defend themselves. They were waiting to see if humanity would choose fear or understanding. Sarah felt the weight of her father's life work, of all the shepherd's sacrifices, pressing down on this moment. In her hand, she held the quantum control pad that could either strengthen the temporal connection or collapse it entirely. "Director Collins," she said quietly, "Dad used to say that the hardest part of being a shepherd wasn't maintaining the sight. It was maintaining faith in humanity's ability to face its own future without fear." She held out the control pad to him. "So what's it going to be? Do we prove the shepherds right, or do we let fear destroy 50 years of preparation for this moment?" Above them, the future humans waited in perfect stillness. Around them, military units tensed for orders. And in her mind, Sarah heard her father's voice from childhood. "Sometimes the biggest choices look the smallest when you're making them." The fate of two timelines hung on what happened next. Director Collins held the quantum control pad with trembling hands, its lights pulsing in sync with the temporal field above. For a long moment, there was perfect stillness. Military units frozen in position, future humans waiting in their quantum suspension, and Sarah holding her breath as 3 generations of preparation hung in the balance. Then the ground beneath them shuddered. "Something's wrong!" Wright called out, her equipment screaming with new alerts. "The quantum field, it's destabilizing!" Sarah felt it before she saw it, a change in the basement's resonant frequency that her father had taught her to fear. The future humans above shifted uneasily, their forms flickering with increased temporal distortion. "The other sites," Martinez reported through the radio network. "They're experiencing similar disruptions. The synchronization is breaking down." Sarah's mind raced through her father's journals, searching for answers. Then she remembered his last hidden entry. "The temporal barrier goes both ways. If they can reach back to us, something else can reach forward to them." The realization hit her just as the basement floor cracked open, revealing the liquid metal surface beneath. But now, it wasn't just reflecting light. It was pulsing with its own dark energy. "It was never just about our future reaching back," she said, understanding flooding in. "There was something else down there. Something that's been waiting for this moment, when the barriers between times would be at their weakest." The future humans moved with sudden urgency, their carefully measured protocols forgotten in the face of a greater threat. One of them spoke, their voice carrying genuine fear. "The shepherds didn't just teach us how to reach back safely, they helped us contain what lay between the times, the thing that feeds on temporal energy itself." Collins's military training kicked in. "All units, fall back, establish a containment perimeter." But Sarah was already moving toward the basement, her father's lifetime of preparation guiding her steps. "The floor," she called out. "Dad wasn't trying to keep us from breaking it. He was making sure we'd know how to fix it when the time came." The liquid metal surface was rippling now, dark shapes moving beneath it that defied description, creatures that existed in the spaces between moments, drawn to the temporal energy like moths to flame. "Sarah," Martinez shouted, "the quantum readings are off the scale." She reached her father's equipment, understanding now why he'd made her memorize every control, every setting. The future humans had been right to approach slowly, carefully. Their gentle arrival hadn't drawn the attention of what lived in the void between times. But now that the barriers were open, All sites, she broadcast, her fingers flying across controls. Initialize containment protocols. The patterns we learned, they weren't just for communication. They were a defense system. The future humans moved in perfect synchronization with her actions, their advanced capabilities finally unleashed not against humanity, but in defense of both timelines. The military units, understanding the true threat at last, fell in alongside them. From the liquid metal surface, something began to emerge, a form that hurt the eyes to look at, existing in multiple times simultaneously. But Sarah didn't flinch. 3 generations of shepherds had prepared for this moment. "Dad," she whispered, activating the quantum harmonics, "I understand now. I understand everything. The battle for both past and future was about to begin." The thing from between times rose from the liquid metal surface like a nightmare given form, its shape constantly shifting between possibilities. But Sarah's hands remained steady on her father's equipment, implementing the defense protocols hidden in 50 years of preparation. All sites reporting similar breaches, Martinez called out, monitoring the radio network. Temporal entities emerging at all 7 locations. The future humans moved with incredible grace, their bodies phasing in and out of reality as they engaged the creature directly. But even their advanced capabilities seemed to struggle against something that existed outside of time itself. "The quantum harmonics," Sarah shouted to Collins, who still held the control pad. "Dad's notes, the frequencies have to synchronize perfectly, all 7 sites at once." The director's military training warred with everything he was seeing, but understanding finally won out. His fingers flew across the pad, coordinating with Sarah's controls. The air filled with impossible frequencies as past and future technology aligned. The patterns, Wright realized, studying her readings. The shepherds weren't just teaching our future how to communicate, they were teaching us all how to fight these things together. The creature recoiled as the harmonics hit it, its form becoming more solid, more vulnerable. The future humans pressed their advantage, using capabilities they'd carefully introduced over decades of preparation. "Sarah," one of them called out, their voice carrying through the quantum field. "The containment grid, it requires both timelines, your technology and ours, working in perfect sync." She understood. The original shepherds hadn't just been maintaining sites or facilitating communication. They'd been building a defense system that could only work if humanity's past and future cooperated perfectly. Military units moved into position around the farm, their weapons reconfigured to match the quantum frequencies. Collins coordinated. Their efforts, decades of tactical experience adapting to an impossible situation. "All sites," Sarah broadcast, "initialize final containment sequence. The pattern is in your family records, the real reason they made us memorize those numbers." The creature lashed out with temporal energy, trying to disrupt the coordination between times. But the future humans had learned patience from the shepherds, and humanity's military had learned to trust what they didn't understand. Sarah's fingers danced across her father's equipment, implementing the true purpose of his life's work. The quantum harmonics rose to a fever pitch as 7 sites activated simultaneously, creating a temporal net that even creatures from between times couldn't escape. "Now!" she commanded. The future humans moved as one, their forms fully stabilized by the quantum field. Military units fired in perfect sync, their weapons enhanced by technology from millennia ahead. And beneath it all, the original frequency patterns the shepherds had discovered pulsed in perfect harmony. The creature's form began to collapse, drawn back into the liquid metal surface as the temporal barriers reasserted themselves. Similar scenes played out at all 7 sites, as humanity's past and future worked together to contain what lived between times. As the last of the entity vanished, the future humans turned to Sarah. "The shepherds were right," one said. "Humanity's Greatest strength isn't in technology or power, it's in our ability to work together across time itself. The quantum field stabilized, no longer straining against temporal intrusion. Around the farm, military units stood down as the immediate threat faded, but something else remained. A connection between times, carefully built over 50 years, now proven stronger than any force that would break it. "Your father would be proud," Collins said quietly, handing the control pad back to Sarah. "He saw further than any of us." Through the quantum field, she could see glimpses of Earth's future, not as a place of fear or destruction, but as a world where humanity had learned to reach across time to help itself evolve. "He wasn't seeing further," Sarah replied, understanding at last. "He was just willing to take the time to look carefully at what was right in front of us." The future humans began to phase out, their forms becoming translucent as they returned to their own time. But the connection remained. 7 sites, carefully maintained, ready to bridge past and future whenever humanity needed to remember it was never truly alone. Dawn broke over the Thompson farm, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and amber. The military presence had withdrawn, the future humans had returned to their time, and the quantum field had settled into a gentle hum that only those who knew to listen for it could hear. Sarah stood on her father's porch, her porch now, watching the sun rise as she had so many times as a child. But this time, she understood why he'd insisted on checking the readings every morning. It hadn't been paranoia, it had been devotion. "The other sites are stabilizing," Martinez reported, joining her with coffee. "The new generation of shepherds is settling into their roles." Through the quantum harmonics, they could feel the gentle pulse of communication between times, not the desperate reaching of before, but a careful, measured dialogue that would continue for generations to come. "The military's official story is interesting," Wright added, checking her phone. "Weather anomalies and experimental atmospheric research. Classic government understatement. Let them tell whatever story they need to," Sarah replied. "The truth is in the foundations now, in the land itself." She walked to the edge of the porch where the floorboards her father had so carefully maintained still held their precise patterns. Not just wood and nails, but a mathematics of protection that spanned centuries. Director Collins had left her with a choice: maintain the official story and keep the farm, or speak out and lose everything. It hadn't really been a choice at all. The shepherds had always known that some truths were meant to be lived, not spoken. "You'll stay?" Martinez asked quietly. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her inheritance, not just the farm or the equipment, but the responsibility of maintaining humanity's connection to its own future. The sacred duty of ensuring that when our descendants reached back through time, they would find hands ready to grasp theirs. "Dad used to say that farming was about patience," she said, smiling at memories that finally made sense. "About understanding. That the most important things take time to grow." Above the farm, the morning sun caught the last shimmer of quantum energies, a reminder that humanity's future was always present, waiting to be carefully nurtured into being. Sarah Thompson, daughter of a shepherd, guardian of the 7th site, took her father's old notebook and made the first entry in her own careful hand. "Dawn reading stable. The conversation continues." The future was calling, and she was ready to answer.